Welcome to the Easton Book Festival. Thank you for coming to the Memoir Revolution. Our book festival is sponsored by the Lafayette Humanities Center, the Greater Easton Development Partnership, Start Strong PA and Pre-K for PA, the Lafayette Literary Magazine, the Lafayette College Store, Quadrant Book Mart and Coffee House. And our host tonight is Jerry Waxler, and I'm going to turn things over to him right away. Jerry?
Okay, thanks, thanks, Andy. That's just so great to be here at the Easton Book Festival because we're celebrating books, and a festival is celebrating community. And we are, all three of us, are lifetime commitment people to try to make the best sense of books and community. So I think this is going to be a fun discussion, somewhat informal. All three of us have devoted years of our lives to fostering the value of books in community and among people. So I'm sure we have a lot to say about it. I am billing this talk as a talk about memoirs mostly because, for example, I teach memoir writing, and I've written quite a bit about memoir writing. And I find that memoirs are this wonderful intersection between the lives that we live and the stories that we share. And one of the reasons that I became so interested in memoir as a form that was important to me is that you get to a certain age where you're not quite sure what life is, or you look around and you read the news and you're not quite sure what's going on. Stories have always been, since the beginning of time, as far as I understand. I wasn't there at the beginning of time, but according to scholar Joseph Campbell, stories have been part of our civilization since the very dawn of human experience. And so we really rely on stories to make sense of experience, to make sense of how we relate to each other, to make sense of our communities. And memoirs are our attempt to use story to make sense of our own lives. So I believe that it's something that everyone can participate in, whether they're reading memoirs or trying to write their own. I'll introduce our other two panelists in a minute because we come at this, each one of us comes at this from a slightly different direction, but we all are passionate about how books and stories can serve everyone. And I'd like to learn more from each of you, Andy and Lorraine, about how that works for you. Just brief introduction. Andy is the owner, if I get this correctly, but the owner and a lifetime actor, the owner of Easton Book and Puppet Company. So one of the things that fascinates me about the Easton Book and Puppet Company when I first heard about it is what in the world is the connection between books and puppets? And it turns out there's a very rich, complex, intricate connection that I completely appreciate now once I've understood it. And it's so perfect and beautiful that Andy's supporting and fostering this festival. And Lorraine, I met through her memoir. I've read hundreds of memoirs, and Lorraine's memoir popped onto my list somehow, and I met her in person, and we're kind of all pretty local to the Easton area. And Lorraine has gone from writing her own memoir to writing other people's memoirs and to teaching memoir workshops and so on. So I'll let you share your perspectives on that, Lorraine. So enough about I could go on and on. I teach classes about memoirs and I give talks, and I'm kind of like the Johnny Appleseed. I think that memoirs are good for all kinds of things, and I'll kind of cover that perhaps over the course of the hour. But I'd like to hear from you guys, and we can have whatever level of informal conversation develops. So Andy, do you want to share your perspective on why puppets and how they relate to books and how all that relates to community?
Well, Book and Puppet Company was founded by me and by my wife, Rebecca Migdal, who is the puppeteer. And I am part of her puppet theater, which is called the Yippee Skippy Puppet Theater. And we perform for children, and we've been performing for children together for, for 10 years before we opened Book and Puppet Company. So we actually built a puppet theater inside of the store, and we made the practice of improvisational puppetry for children and adults part of the store. But I think that what you're alluding to is the idea of the characters in the books, and the notion that the puppets embody the stories, brought to life. And puppets do have a kind of an entree into people's consciousness. People kind of let down their guard when they encounter a puppet. And you see this with babies and toddlers who take the puppet, will talk to a puppet, but won't talk to an adult. And you see it with adults too. And we run puppet shows for adults too. For instance, we run Dream Theater, where people come up to the front of the stage and narrate their dream into the microphone. And then Rebecca has her puppets act the dream out. So we want to encourage people to become authors, to tell stories in the bookstore, their own stories. So they're surrounded by books, but there's also this whole, again, encouragement of people to explore their own creativity while they're in the bookstore. That's sort of the Book and Puppet Company idea.
So children, one of the things that I always say about stories, and one of my kind of proofs that they're so important to people, is how children at the earliest age are fascinated by stories. And I just, puppets bring them to life, but books bring them to life too. I visit my niece, and her little tiny son comes running up to me with his favorite book and asks me to read it to him. And so it's like children are very tuned into books, and there's something about that curiosity about stories that seems to never die at any age. We still go to the movies, and we want stories so badly.
And they love to have the physical book also. Of course, as a bookseller, I am an advocate for real books as opposed to ebooks and tablets and screens. And I think that, the pediatricians say that children should have very limited screen time before the age of 2 or 3. And the physical books are extremely important because they are shared between the loving, attentive adult and the child. It's a medium, it's a means for togetherness when it's with young children. So that what you're doing with that child is very powerful for the child.
Yeah. And how about you, Lorraine? What sort of experience do you have as a book person who's become? My understanding is that you were sort of fate pushed you into memoir writing, and from there, how did you end up here?
Well, yeah, the piece of fate that pushed me into memoir writing was unfortunately the death of my daughter, who was my only child, who was stillborn. She would be 22 if she was alive today. Before that, I was a journalist and very much enmeshed in stories, surrounded by stories, understanding their significance, but I would be reporting them from the outside in. This memoir is from the inside out. It's the same thing with the puppets. There's the story or a conflict that's in you, and somehow these books, these puppets, they allow us to put the story somewhere in the real world, and then our relationship to the story changes. So it's a healing experience often, and it certainly was for me getting through the stillbirth of my daughter, the first memoir. But all of us really are born into a story, right? So it's from the beginning. We have to figure out where we are and what the story expects of us and what our role is in it, and if we're going to accept that role. And all that takes a lot of processing, a lot of drama, and that's the stuff of memoir. And memoir the narrative form itself, the way it juxtaposes our inner life and our outer life, helps us process.
So thank you for that. Yeah, so processing through story is this amazing thing. I mean, and again, the journey from small child through adulthood, and then major setbacks like what you experienced, and then having to carry on. Stories can be so powerful. I mean, I think that, Andy, your experience with children is that they are so fascinated and curious and alive and invigorated. But what's really, in addition, what's happening is that we're helping them put the pieces together through story, because story is this fundamental thought process. And what happens later in life when things don't go as your original story planned, like losing a baby, just such a disruption to what you think your story of your life is supposed to be, the redevelopment of a story is such a beautiful, creative way to kind of reposition and reglue the things that go wrong in life and make them part of your story. You become like the author of that story, and so it makes more sense. It's healing in a very abstract way that most people don't think of. You're putting together the pieces of your life in a way that you can use to carry on to the next step, whether you're a baby or an adult or an older person. So very cool. Andy, you wrote some memoirs. What prodded you to do that?
Well, of course, I'm a bookseller, and I've owned bookstores and had many authors come to do programs in bookstores, and people who knew me as a bookseller would sometimes ask me, are you going to write a book? And I would always say, no, I'm not an author. I know what an author is. An author is somebody who's very good at writing and works hard at it. And I'm running a bookstore, and that's what I try to do well. So I knew my place. I knew that I should not write a book. And people nagged me for years about this, because what was happening in my bookstore was kind of strange. I opened a children's bookstore in Chicago in 1985. And then there were all these huge, category killer bookstores, superstores that opened in the late 90s. And I went out of business. And, not too long after that, You've Got Mail came out, this movie about a small children's bookstore that was killed by superstores. That's really when people started saying, Andy, that's you. You should write a book about that. And I still said, I'm not an author. An author is somebody who's good at writing a book. But then I lost my next store, and I was working for an author, Eric Carr, the owner of the founder of the Eric Carr Museum of Picture Book Art, author of The Very Hungry Caterpillar, and 70 other books, had hired me to run his children's bookstore at his museum. And he and his wife said to me that I should write a book about what had happened to me as a bookseller. And so the fact that an author, a very successful author, told me, they kind of gave me permission. They knew I wasn't a real author, but I was still allowed to write. And I started writing, and I have it here. I just wrote down everything that I could remember about my life. I wrote a 250,000 page, I just wrote everything. All the anecdotes that I had ever told, plus my theories about the world, and an instructional manual about how to run a creative bookstore. And so I had this gigantic thing, and I sent it to some agents, and I heard nothing from them. And but I did start hearing, I sent it out to 25 different people who I knew who were in the book industry. And what I heard back was, oh no, this is not a book. One guy told me, this is 5 books. You wrote 5 books and they're all mixed together. So I didn't know what I was doing. And it took some time before I found a publisher who agreed to essentially publish one of the threads that was in my massive, download. And that was this book, Rebel Bookseller, which is much shorter. And that's how that book came to be.
Mm. Oh, there's so many great lessons in that story, Andy. Thank you. Like, I love the tentativeness and the unwillingness to put yourself into the I'm not an author, I can't do this category. And that happens so much for adults who try to think about that we're all experts in our own lives. And we look back on our lives and perhaps fate had not given us the opportunity to spend a lifetime in writing. So of course we're not good at it, but we have all the raw material because we've lived this life. And so at the point when you say, I can do this, that's when you can start to become an author. And I think that's the wrinkle to, oh no, I'm not an author is, well, but yeah, everything you've ever learned is something that you started somewhere and then proceeded to learn how to do it. So in fact, that process of learning how to become an author is such an invigorating, humanizing experience. It's like a hobby, but it's a verbal hobby, it's an introspective hobby, it's a literary hobby, and you get better and better at expressing yourself. And so in the end of the process, you become so much more confident about who you are and how you can relate to the world. So it's a beautiful journey that you took from I can't possibly do that to I'm going to try it, and then you took that first run through, which is an awesome first intuitive step, and then you got help. So it's really kind of like a hero's journey to actually create the memoir. And
what a memory. 250,000 words. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. I try to write down every story that I had told to somebody. I tried to remember myself at different ages and like, what did I used to talk about? And then I would just tell that story. So that was the voice that I was in, just trying to remember everything I ever said that I thought was interesting.
So I wonder if being an actor helped you with that. The storytelling aspect.
Well, I don't know. I mean, everything went into it. I did want to mention, I worked as a children's theater actor for a couple of years, and I traveled around the country in a van performing in elementary school cafeterias for 500 kids crammed into a cafeteria and 4 actors up in the front. And these are kindergartners and 3rd graders. And our theater company was called Child's Play Touring Theater, and we performed stories and poems written by children. So the schools would submit hundreds of stories and poems. We would read them, sometimes at night with a flashlight while driving in the van. And then the next day we would act them out. We put them up on their feet, and dances and songs and so forth. We performed thousands of stories written by children. So during that period, I read a lot of things written by 6-year-olds and 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds. And then I opened a bookstore afterwards. And one of the most striking things for me about becoming a buyer for resale of books professionally published was that these professionally published books were boring compared to what 5-year-olds were writing and 8-year-olds were writing. These kids were nuts. The stuff they wrote was crazy, and it was a lot of fun. It was fun to act it out. And the stuff that came through the industry of publishing with the editors and the marketers and so forth, all the edges smoothed down, all the the controversy removed, and that was really it was a fascinating journey for me to sort of become used to the idea that books were the creation of a commercial activity that was supposed to enter a marketplace and people were supposed to buy them, and that's going to mean that you've got to do certain things, and it cuts into the authenticity, it cuts into the honesty to have to make it into a commercial product. So,
Go ahead, Lorraine.
I like the idea of starting by asking yourself, what stories am I talking about when I tell people? But what's interesting, that what happens in memoir workshops often is that folks discover that they've been telling half stories or skewed stories. And the longer they stay in a circle, or the longer they take workshops, those stories become more real. The darker aspects start opening up. And
wow.
people realize that they have moved from one iteration of themselves to the next. And that instead of regretting who you were, realize that former versions of yourself made you who you are today. That's one of the fascinations of
Yeah,
memoir.
yeah. So sort of you're bringing me back to adulthood, because I love Andy's stories about childhood. Just amazing that the children have all this creative curiosity. But in adulthood, the problem with the stories we tell each other, and this may be different for you, Andy, just because you've got such a lust for life kind of personality, but for adults, when we tell each other stories, are really, a lot of times they're very limited. I think of family stories around the dinner table. There might be a little too much food and alcohol, and it's always got to have a punchline. A lot of times the dinner table stories are, at someone's expense, so that it gets everybody laughing, ah ha ha. But they are very formulaic, and the actual authentic emotion. I think one of the things that is so different about memoir writing than normal conversation is how normal conversation, you don't want to bring people down. So you don't want to say anything like too serious or heavy. I mean, it's almost universal that if you're going to say something heavy, it's going to be like to your therapist, or to, maybe you're drunk at the time, but you typically would kind of gloss over the bad stuff so that you could say, oh, everything kind of worked out, or whatever. But in memoir writing, people really want the opportunity to go all the way into a story and let themselves go. When you read a book, there's a powerful thing about books that's different from ordinary life. You read a book, you're shutting the world out. You're sitting down, a lot of times you're alone or whatever at the beach, and you're allowing yourself, you're saying to the author here, take me for a ride. So the author's job is to let it all hang out, to bring you into the bad parts, because it's from there that you can climb back up through courage and strength and so on. And this is the opportunity, both in reading memoirs, because we can see how it works for other people, and in writing memoirs, because then you get to apply that climbing principle to your own experience. And the raw emotion that you can allow in a memoir it's an unusual opportunity to really let yourself open up. And I guess in a way, correct me if I'm wrong, but in a way it's childlike, because children don't have all of that complex, intricate emotional mess. So they can open themselves up to, hey, I wanted a second helping of dessert, and scream if they don't get it. And for them, that's the reality. But in an adult, you lose someone you love, or, you're betrayed by a lover or something, and it's just like rips you apart. And those are things that we usually hide. But in memoirs, you can reveal it and then show the journey to a higher place. So I don't know how that applies to your experience, Lorraine.
Well, readers of memoirs, I mean, the books help them live. In my experience, the people who are the readers gravitate to a story because there's something about it, its themes or its circumstances, that resonate with their own life. And they say, oh, somebody moved through this. In my case, with the stillbirth, people want to know that you came out the other side intact, and you're standing and smiling and living. That alone is inspiration at that point. I did read about the School of Life in London, where they have something called bibliotherapy. You could go in and say, this is my problem I'm grappling with now, and they'll prescribe you some books, memoirs or narratives, and just get the emotions moving, really.
mhm, mhm, mhm.
Hmm.
So reading is another whole area, and that's really so important part of the memoirs, because before like the 2000s or before the 1990s, you didn't ever expect to have a memoir by an ordinary person on a best-selling list. I don't think it happened, and certainly wasn't a common phenomenon. And after the 90s, it's become like a regular thing, and people are accustomed, have become acclimated to the concept that it's okay for ordinary people to have interesting lives. And so we have this whole kind of population of people who are saying, yeah, I am interested in other people. And then that fosters the permission for the rest of us to say, well, maybe I could tell my story. Maybe it's not such a elitist thing. So it's really opened up a lot of emotional communication.
One of the things about the popularity of this, it's really explosively popular, memoirs as a genre, is that people trust them. Non-celebrities, ordinary folks, there's an automatic kind of bonding that goes on, and people trust is a big word in the age of the net.
Yeah.
In the age of media, that as media becomes less trusted, unfortunately,
Yeah.
these books have become more trusted.
Yeah. So one thing about that, one of the things about books, getting back to the book thing, is that when you read a memoir, you're going all the way in. It's like, this isn't just an article, because I read, you read articles just stream past you all the time. But a book, you're setting yourself aside and you're entering into this relationship with the author. And the thing about memoirs that's different from celebrities is that memoirs do not traffic in exaggeration or high stylized drama. Memoirs are very much down to earth and real people. So these are things that people don't really have a reason to lie about. And once you're inside a memoir, the intricacies of how they lead you through their lives is so interesting and genuine. It's almost like, for me, when I discovered memoir reading, it was almost like opening up a whole new channel into what makes people tick, because they were revealing all the things about who they were as people in a way that I'd never had any access to before. So when you talk to someone, as we said, it can be very superficial, but even all the things that we think we know about people, we don't really know much about their past or where they've come from. But in a memoir, they've led you on this journey, and it's a way of bonding with people in the most amazing walks of life. And as for the quality, or are they really authors, I like to think of it as a sort of folk art, because what is it, like, you would never not play basketball in your backyard because you were afraid you wouldn't be in the NBA. So sometimes people will like refuse to write because they're not going to be bestsellers or something. But it's like it's a graduated climb, and every step you take is a step further along. So from the point of view of starting out as a complete novice and then working up and maybe finding an editor or a coach or a class and then developing that skill. I've read lots of memoirs by people who were going back for their writing training in their 40s and 50s. And it's just a great thing because each of us has already lived these complex lives. So all we need is just to layer on top of that the skill to write about it, because we already have the material. So yes, it's an opening up of people to each other that is remarkable. And whether people actually end up getting published in like a traditional sense, or just do it for their friends and family. It's all a process. It's all an amazing process.
Well, I've been a bookseller for years, and I was running the store at the Bank Street College of Education about 6 or 7 years ago, and I ran a sale for the Educators for Social Responsibility conference at Bank Street College on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And there were about 200 teachers who had come to see a speaker. And this fellow he specialized in working with troubled urban youth. And he himself had been in gangs as a teenager and had been in jail. And when he got out, he had devoted himself to working with youth to try to help kids from going into jail or going through what he'd gone through and how to get them out of gang life. And he had written a book for educators, but he'd also written a memoir, and he had self-published both of these. And I had picked up a couple dozen copies of each of these, and I had them at book tables. So I was selling for him while he was in there giving a speech. And I poked my head into the auditorium and listened to him talk. And he was a terrific speaker. And he told about what he had done that had gotten him arrested when he was 15 years old. And all these teachers were just riveted to his description of, running from the cops and hiding in his grandmother's basement. And when they came out of that auditorium, they all came over to the table, and they all wanted to buy not his sort of textbook about how to work with young people. They all wanted to buy his memoir. And I hadn't bought enough copies. I had, 15 copies of the memoir and 40 copies of the textbook. I hadn't expected that, they'd all want to know more about his life. So as I said, this was a self-published book, and he was a very compelling speaker. But the truth is that, the book was, he wasn't a professional, nonfiction author. He was somebody who was, right in the middle of a very high stakes life. And this document that he'd written, this memoir, was extremely compelling. Yeah. And that's all it took for people to want to read it. They didn't care how polished it was, and it was fine. It was a good piece of writing. It wasn't exquisite.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so to your point earlier about how the publishing industry maybe actually smooths out the rough edges, which is a good thing, but it's also kind of less raw and less, sometimes I'm not a sports person, but sometimes you feel like the college basketball teams are more real and more, vibrant, and they've got more skin in the game because they're younger. And, so it's like the passion that each memoir writer brings to their memoir it's their life. So that you can feel that about the story, that maybe we're accustomed, I grew up reading, classics, the 100-year-old classics that survived the test of time. So of course, great literature is a wonderful thing, but I've read hundreds of memoirs, from bestsellers to ones that I just met the author and hadn't even been published yet. And I love them all, because for me, it's an effort for people to share their lives and to make the effort to craft it into something readable in that book form. So that's just a passion of mine.
And you just never know what will be a bestseller. John Lennon once said, if we all knew what would sell, we'd all be at the Fontainebleau in Miami.
Right.
But take Mary Carr. When she was the first one, the grandmother of memoir, the second wave here, to write about her dysfunctional family.
Right.
For example, I think was the first one. And no one knew how that would go over. They just had no idea. And I remember reading at one of the first gatherings she read at, there was like 1,000 people showed up, and they all were online saying, what happened to me? And what happened to our family? This and that. And it was helping them all process it. It became an entire subgenre in itself.
Right.
So you never know. And maybe, there is no formula for success. Maybe you can industrialize that formula too much, And it's the surprise elements of something like memoirs that can pioneer
Yeah,
bestselling.
yeah. It's the uniqueness. We're all unique. So one of the things that's really, really cool about Andy and the childhood wonder is that those little children with all of their little quirky individualized wonder are going to grow up to be us. And we have those little pockets of wonder, but we're not quite sure where they got to. And trying to find our own stories as a way of developing sort of a more of that same sense of curiosity about the lives we've lived.
Well, Jerry, I want to throw something in there because this is an experience that I had when I was working for Child's Play Touring Theater as an actor, reading all those children's stories. One thing that was very, very noticeable about reading tens of thousands of stories and poems by children is that the stories that were written by 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds were absolutely fabulous. They were nuts and they were wonderful. And a lot of it was clearly autobiographical. But stories that were written by 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds were much more boring. You could tell that they had been, learning how to do it. And they, it was just getting all smoothed out. And I really had the sense during those years, I remember feeling like the school system, the educational system, just crushes the creativity out of children. That was my feeling, that these kids are just, they're losing it. And it was sad. Sometimes the older kids would be writing, a 10-page story or a 50 or a play, and they were so pedestrian and sort of unimaginative. But the little kids were just writing these wildly imaginative things and also telling sometimes amazing and peculiar stories. There was a piece that a child wrote about shoplifting from a comic book store. This was a 7-year-old. He wrote a story about how there's characters named Tom and Andy, and one of the characters is in the comic book store. He wants the comic book, and the other character comes up to him and says, "I know you want it. Why don't you just take it?" And then there's like another scene, and it was just great. And we performed this in this school and gave the kid a prize. And afterwards, we learned from the teacher that this kid had been in trouble for shoplifting. And, we had told his story on the stage, and it was a true story. So we never knew whether something like that was happening or not. But that vividness, that vivacity became something that the kids weren't writing as they got older. And I think that when you say, we've got this spark of wonder from childhood that's still in us as adults, I think so. And I think that it is really hard for people to kind of allow that to emerge again.
Yeah. So, and I think one of the ways that they do it is they keep going back to consume stories. And I think we're kind of we're hung up on going to the shows and other people's stories, trying to scratch that itch to find that story. But the real need, the real thirst, the real itch is to find your own story, to find that story within you. So this is a little different than, so memoir writing is a little different from fiction writing because that was based on a true story. And then he created this, amazing story that just blew your mind. In memoirs, we have a little bit of a reverse problem where we take the experiences that we've actually lived. And so it's the actual slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that we take as raw material. And then we have to take that material and shape it into something that resembles a story with a beginning, middle, and end, a character on a journey. And so discovering how that works, discovering how you were actually a character on a journey is so interesting. I think, Lorraine, you probably had the experience, you teaching workshops and working with people where they'll tell you what they've been through, and your brain just starts to put together the story because you've been through so many stories. It's like, oh, I see how, I see, people, because people come to this and say, I don't know where to start. I don't know what the story is. I just lived this life. But then they start telling you the experiences that they've had, and you listen to it. And from a story writer's point of view, it's like, oh my God, that the story is right there. You've got it. You just have to kind of tease it out of the experiences and find a way to get it shaped on, within, like that book, Andy, that's a great example, because there's a whole book about your everything. And the challenge that your editor helped you with was like, okay, how do you find that story with beginning, middle, and end from it?
Yeah,
And
I didn't know what my friend who said you've got 5 books all mixed together. I didn't know how to separate them out.
Right,
I couldn't figure that out.
Right. So yeah, and that's part of the learning process to sort of understand. So one of the coolest things about it being a memoir, a genre. So memoir is not just something that it's not just this abstract thing that says write the story of your life. Memoir is a genre that you can that works because you can read bunches of them and see how they work and see what kind of instigating things happen where the story can start and how it's propelled and all the inner turmoil and so on, and then kind of reaches some kind of a conclusion. So a lot of it is taking place in a very psychological way. One of the things about the memoir genre is that it's taking place to a large extent inside your mind, because you're trying, as a human being, we're all trying to make sense of who we are and where we're going and where we've been. And a memoir is that experience of trying to understand yourself.
And I think workshopping is partially reversing the filters that Andy's talking about, that we get all the good parts get filtered out of us. So we present a sanitized kind of version or a neater kind of version of reality than it actually was. But as adults, we can then reverse that filter.
So could you explain, just give us an example or show us what that looks like?
I think more people, unlike Andy, start off with a very small idea of what they'd like to write about, but it's a very explosive seed, that small idea. And then when you start exploring the scenes, the emotions, and how they resonated over time and how they developed over time, the story gets larger and larger. So sometimes people will filter their story almost out of existence, but still feel the call to write. So that's what workshopping and being in circles does.
Right. Oh, that's great. Yeah, the brainstorming thing, the community thing. So, so the community of a book festival, of course, we're not we don't have roaring crowds out in, out in the audience, or they might be, but we can't hear them roar. But the festival idea of them being entertained or being together in a group is one type of community. But the other type of community that you're talking about, Lorraine, is every bit as fascinating, and that's the small group community, because people come together and say, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to write this story. I don't know who I was really. You come together in these little groups, I guess maybe in a little bit like your acting workshop, Andy. I'm not sure if the analogy works, but if in a writing workshop you come together and people are working together and thinking together and sharing stories with each other, and you kind of hear, as you're trying to explain your story, as you're reading a story out loud, you're not only hearing it yourself read it, you're watching other people's eyes as they're hearing it. And in that experience in a group, there's this amazing chemistry that happens where people really open up to understanding what their lives sound like to other people when told as a story. And that's so different from most of the rest of life, where you kind of hope. That's why everybody wants to mow their lawn, or live in a great house, or drive the latest cars, because you want people to see you and say, oh, there's a person of substance. But they don't see, it's just such an external, superficial thing to see that. But when you're sharing the story of yourself, it's so much more real and personal and connected. And it's almost like a magical way of human beings relating to each other. So I think there's just so many different dimensions of it that even though workshop sounds like a very specialized experience, I run groups in libraries and just any place, senior centers, colleges, any place where people get together, they can like write a story about themselves and share it, and all of a sudden, boom! It's like, oh, we're all the same, but we're all different. It's amazing. I had this Salvation Army. I gave a talk, and this 85-year-old woman came up to me and said, "You reminded me of this prayer I used to sing when I was 7." And she started to sing it to me, and I was just like, oh my God, I just got goosebumps, because it's this connection that happens in the story, in the land of stories, that doesn't happen in ordinary conversation or interaction. I feel so privileged to have heard her sing that, because she'd given me a glimpse of something that was just so magical and precious to her.
I remember in that vein, I remember reading from Life Touches Life and Mother's Story of Stillbirth and Healing, my first memoir. And a woman came up to me who had a stillbirth in 1945. And she said, I've never said a word about it. And I can't believe I'm in a bookstore listening to this. It's just amazing.
Yeah,
and another woman came up from 1960. You know what she said? She said, I had a stillbirth in 1960. Are you telling me it wasn't my fault?
Wow.
All those decades.
Yeah.
Talk about the power of story.
Yeah. They're reviewing.
I did a University Without Walls undergraduate degree. I dropped out of college when I was a teenager, and I went back to college when I was in my 40s. And we had a class in which there was 30 adults who were all going back to college to get midlife to getting bachelor's degrees. And we all had to write an essay about something that had happened in our lives, anything we wanted. And then we read these out loud to each other. And so 30 adults read sort of 10-page essays aloud to each other. And the diversity of the lives that we had led was astonishing. I mean, I am sure most of those people were not writing for publication. They were writing those essays because, they'd been assigned it and they were going to get some college credit. But it is true. We live in a mass society. We go out on the street. We say hello to people. We drive our cars. We see other cars pass us. And it does not really strike us how remarkably diverse our lives have, completely unique our lives have been.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's one of the privileges of leading memoir workshops is that I get that like every day.
Yes.
Just so amazing. Yeah, people, and and in a class where people will read to each other, they'll have that same reaction you did, Andy. It's like, oh my God, there's so many different stories here. But that's my privilege of running them, is that I get to see that every single time, and then that same reaction. Oh my God, people are so different. So it's just this amazing opportunity that we all have now to take advantage of that, and when the book thing is just so odd, because a lot of people say they don't have time for books, and you think about looking back over your life and you think, well, I could remember a few things. Yeah, I could remember a few more things. But to think in terms of just to have the idea, the concept of this book length thing that's just shows the evolution that you had to have through a certain period of your life. I mean, when we were 3 and barely just learning, just barely walking, and to the time we're 18, we had so many different moving parts to put together.
Mhm.
Once you're 18, you're just off and running. You've got a whole life ahead of you. You got to figure everything out. But that period of time that you just went through is so fraught with all the developmental things that make you you. And you would never go back to look at that and understand that in any other framework than if you sat down and wrote it. So, I know it seems sort of foreign. I don't know how you did it, Andy, in terms of, your willingness to sit down and write 250,000 words. There's some serious commitment going on there. But, I think anyone who writes the memoir has some kind of commitment to saying, I'm going to do this. I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know what I'm doing when I start, but I really want to do this. And it's a journey. I think it's like playing, like you think about somebody who learned how to play the violin, and all the steps that you had to go through from that first little squeak, not knowing how to make the sound, to really being able to play a piece of music. And it's just like years of development and climbing. And learning to write is the same thing, but it's something that you can do at any age. It doesn't require micro muscular skills, that you'd only have when you were 5. So we don't have to learn like the coordination of a tennis player. We just have to sit there and put together the thoughts that made us who we are. And so it's a wonderful hobby for everybody, really.
And it's also, you come to an appreciation that in ordinary lives, in every ordinary life, there are extraordinary elements. And I think you come to have faith and confidence in the importance of your own extraordinary elements, even if they're quiet. I mean, there are some quiet moments that are devastating, that are deep, that are revelatory, that people, have buried to a certain extent. But memoir is an opportunity to bring them up, present them, mine them, celebrate them.
So at what point in your grief did you decide to start writing about the process, so that, and how did that work for you?
Well, I was in the hospital. I mean, I almost died. It was a group B strep infection that killed my daughter Victoria at full term, and then came for me. So I was still in the hospital, and my husband, who knows me very well, put a notebook right on the table that they put over your bed, and I could not string together a whole sentence, but I was just jotting down at the time sounds, voices, sights, any small thing that came to mind. And they would later bring me right back to the moment. But of course, that is a moment of great trauma. You're not going to forget it. But there was a certain immediacy in those pieces that helped me then write when I was better, when I knew I would live, when the fever had broken, and when I left the hospital, and then took long walks around this neighborhood over and over again. I just came back to the desk and started flowing.
So you didn't have the sense. So a lot of times people will say, well, I don't want to remember that because it hurts too much. And somehow you said, I have to remember this so I can figure out how to get past it.
Yes, and there's a very particular psychology to stillbirth, like there is to everything. The baby was never part of the social order. The baby is invisible. So when you write the story, the baby becomes visible. It's a way of saying this baby was here. And when I got my first box of books, it was a very emotional experience because I could hold them. They were physically manifested in the world.
Yes. So that, wow. thanks for that. Yeah, that idea of trauma, you know, people trying to avoid trauma because they're afraid that remembering it'll awaken it is sort of a paradox, because it's also by remembering it that you can work towards getting a handle on it. And I think that that notion of holding a box of books, or holding the book that you created and feeling like you've brought it into existence, is really beautiful and powerful, because it's true for any memoir. It's like you've taken a particularly confusing or complex or difficult or distant part of your life and turned it into a book, and now it's a thing, you know. So to Andy's point about an actual physical book having some substance, it's really poignant, the way you explain that. So thank you.
And you know, trauma turns out to be a portal into a rebirth.
Yeah, that's your second book, right?
Right. And so, you know, staying stuck in the trauma freezes time. But the narrative form, by its very nature, brings things through time. And it sees how it transmutes, how it changes you, how your understanding of it changes. And that's evolution. That's personal history, personal evolution.
Wow, that's very deep. And that's very, so trauma is a very mysterious force. And people who have suffered from trauma and feel frozen by it are very, can be very lost in it. And for you to have gone so deeply and so thoroughly into that process of coming out the other end of it is remarkable and special. And I'm sure you help a lot of people with sharing that. So thank you.
Oh.
Thank you.
So I forgot to look at the time, Andy. I don't know if we're getting close.
Yeah, maybe 5 more minutes.
Okay. Do you want to say anything more about, you know, the book festival, the fact that we're celebrating books, the fact that, you know, I read your Rebel bookseller. Could I just read, I'm so impressed by your subtitle, Why Indie Businesses Represent Everything You Want to Fight For, from free speech to buying local to building communities. And so you're in the middle of an institution just like that, and we're here celebrating in this very low-key festival that proposition. Do you want to say anything more about how you want to?
There's an analogy there. I mean, when you say, you know, indie businesses, those are expressions of, you know, families and individuals. And you know, I took a store, my wife and I rent a storefront, and we say we're a bookstore. That's the same kind of thing as writing a memoir. It's an individual creative act. And, you know, your local businesses are, you know, that's your neighbors trying to sort of survive by serving their neighbors. And, you know, I tried to shop at the Nature's Way grocery store, which is a block away from me. And those guys who own it, they try to shop at my bookstore. And, you know, the brewer up at the Two Rivers Brewery shops at my bookstore, and I go and drink beer at his brewery, and we could barter. We don't need money. And that's what that's about. The idea that independent businesses, it's just us. And you know, the Greater Lehigh Valley Writers Guild, the Greater Group, which is producing this event and which is producing a couple dozen events at this book festival, that's just us. We can, you know, we're not mediated by concentrations of capital, you know, that's traded in shares on Wall Street. It's just us. So yeah, I think that Rebel Booksellers' concept of trying to encourage people to open independent bookstores, which ended up being the mission of my memoir, is trying to convince people to open independent bookstores, written by a guy who had been forced out of business repeatedly. I mean, I'm the worst person to be saying you should open a bookstore, because I failed. I lost money. And that's the book is very paradoxical for that reason, but I kind of embraced that. And a lot of people read it. And people have told me, quite a number of people have told me that it inspired them during their process of opening their own bookstore.
Mm.
So I think that's, that goes to this issue of, who is an author, who is allowed to tell a story, who is a professional. Being an amateur, as you're suggesting with the college basketball, being an amateur is a noble thing. That's what's the phrase? A lover, right? Amor.
Right.
If you just love what you do, you have a passion for it, and so you're going to just do it. And
Yes,
if someone gives you permission, well, that's fine. If someone doesn't give you permission, you do it anyway.
Yeah.
And so I agree. I think that the book festival and the idea of independent book selling is it's of the essence of this sort of autonomous individual creative outflow.
Yeah. Well, this is the third year in a row that I'm contributing my time to the festival, and I think of it as a way to promote books and as a glue, as a bond for the community. So I appreciate your having contributed in that way, and I'm happy to contribute as well. And thanks to Lorraine for kicking in.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
thank you both. And I'm going to switch my hats. I don't have a hat. You've been watching the Memoir Revolution. And I guess we had a revolution just now. And so now everybody who's watching, go and write a memoir.
There you go.
That's right.
And then sell your book in indie store.
If not you, who? If not now, when? And the Easton Book Festival is sponsored by the Lafayette Humanities Center and Greater Easton Development Partnership and a bunch of other very good supporters, Quadrant Book Mart and Cafe. So we'll see you at the next session. Take care. Bye now.
Okay, see you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.